you are in the world. And a warm welcome to you all for this webinar co-organized by UNCTAD and United Nations ESCAP on technology and innovation with equity perspectives from the Asia Pacific. My name is Jonathan Wong. I'm the Chief of Technology Innovation at ESCAP, and I will be your MC and moderator for today. The format for today will be kind of threefold. We'll start by opening remarks from senior leadership, both from UNCTAD and ESCAP, to really set the scene for the session today. We'll then have presentations from UNCTAD and ESCAP officials on UNCTAD's Technology Innovation Report 2021 and ESCAP's Frontiers of Inclusive Innovation Report, respectively, both of which will provide hopefully deeper context to the topic of the webinar today. This will be followed by a panel discussion with a specific focus on AI for social good. And this will be made up of experts from government, civil society, the private sector and academia to discuss and deliberate on the breadth of perspectives on this emerging agenda. And there'll also be an opportunity, hopefully, for some questions to pose to the panel after the panel discussion. So please feel free to start posting your questions in the chat function as they come to you and as these thoughts come to you during the webinar. So let's get started and with setting the scene. And first, it's really my pleasure to invite a very good friend of ESCAP, Shamika Sirimani, Director of the Division of Technology and Logistics at UNCTAD, to give her opening remarks. So Shamika, over to you first. Thank you.
Thank you, Jonathan. Good morning, everyone joining this webinar from all over the region. So as Jonathan said, we are looking at technology and innovation with equity. That's the theme. And this webinar is about perspectives from Asia and the Pacific. So let me also take the opportunity to thank our sister agency, ESCAP, for the excellent collaboration in the organization of this webinar. I think we need to do a lot more as we go forward. The objective is to disseminate two reports. One is UNCTAD's Technology and Innovation Report 2021 and ESCAP's Frontiers of Inclusive Innovation Report. And I think the both reports you will see soon, they examine through different angles the relationship between frontier technologies and inequalities. And so we would like to reflect on their findings and recommendations in the perspectives of the reality of the Asia-Pacific region. And we have an excellent panel that will bring the ground realities. So let me give you a bit of a background of the TIR. And Clovis, my colleague who led the report, will present the specific findings of this report. Now, in our report, we say that the frontier technologies are one of the main forces defining the world of today. And in fact, we all know the COVID-19 pandemic is a great example. We have seen the deployment of technologies such as AI and big data for screening patients, the monitoring the outbreaks, the tracing cases of the disease, and predicting its evolution, assessing infection risk, and and crucially in the development of the vaccine. So we saw how these technologies were deployed. You see that just like COVID-19 shows how frontier technologies can accelerate positive change, it also illustrates the risk of this technological change because they're happening very fast and they can very well leave many people and the countries and the continents behind. The problem is, of course, the lack of the capacity to absorb new technologies in many countries. I mean, one of the problems. I mean, this we all know the skills, the infrastructure, financing, they're all issues. And then there are new also problems of ethics and the workers, livelihoods would matter. So there are many angles to this, new technological revolution, how it can affect our lives. You see, the central point of our report, the Technology and Innovation Report, is that we are at the very early stages of a wave of technological change with broad implications. So we say all countries need to understand what is happening, get prepared to catch this wave of change and ride it forward, and while ensuring that no one is left behind. So let me give you, as we talk about no one is being left behind, let me give you some undesirable effects of this technological change. And we are already witnessing some of these. The number one, the risk of creating new inequalities and exacerbating existing ones in their different dimensions: income, gender, location, age, and more. And the second is the threat of alienating and possibly leaving behind vulnerable groups and communities. And of course, the danger of economic, social, and political discord undermining the cohesion of societies. And these are all these things we have seen in different forms, in recent months and years. So we argue in this report, these technologies are essential for sustainable development, but they could also accentuate existing inequalities. And we also say that inequalities is not a natural phenomena, and it is up to policymakers to bringing policies to reduce the risk and make frontier technologies work for all. And in fact, we have examples where in some countries that have taken income distribution policies, that they have done well in managing inequalities, and some that have given the private sector all the role to create technologies and distribute and deploy these technologies, and the governments back off, and we have seen the inequalities rising. So the inequality is also, it's a political decision. That's what we say in this report. And I think another interesting feature, especially for Asia Pacific, is that the new index that we have created to assess the readiness of countries to use, adopt, and adapt frontier technologies. And it shows that on average, Asia Pacific, there's a tale of two kind of regions emerging in Asia and the Pacific. There are some of the most ready countries to absorb the frontier technologies are in the region, and some least ready are also in the region. So now I think, anyway, you will hear from Clovis and also from Marta. The whole point is to how do we move forward with the policy options for countries of the region to strategically position themselves to take advantage of new waves of technological change for inclusive and sustainable development. And in fact, we had a ministerial conference in UNCTAD, and it's called UNCTAD 15. It's every 4 years. It's our mandate giving conference, and it very clearly identified the impact of these technologies and how the developing countries need to be ready, for this technological wave. So I think UNCTAD is, in that sense, UNCTAD is given a bigger mandate and to deepen our work, to prepare countries to adapt these frontier technologies. They are mostly digital realm. So how do we enter into the digital economy? So this is being, asked us to do a lot more work on this thing. So let me stop here, because I think you will hear from Clovis and Marta the nitty-gritty of these reports. So Jonathan, over to you, and thank you.
Thank you so much, Shamika, for setting the scene. May I now hand over to Rupa Chanda, Director of Trade Investment Innovation Division at ESCAP, to also give her opening remarks and add on to the scene setter. Over to you, Rupa. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Jonathan. A very warm welcome to everybody, and really happy to be partnering with UNCTAD today in co-launching these two reports. Let me just say a few words regarding the role that technology and innovation can play in addressing the SDGs and in bringing in more inclusion in the development process. I think I'll echo a lot of what Shamika has said, because the messages are very similar, I think, at the underlying level across the two reports. Innovation can really increase the efficiency, effectiveness, and impact of efforts to meet the ambitions of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. It's been a source of economic dynamism in the region. It's contributed to economic growth and lifted millions of people out of poverty. At the same time, as Shamika mentioned, it has also exacerbated existing inequalities. It's made it harder to cross frontiers between those who benefit from innovation and those who are excluded. For instance, CO2 emissions have increased in step with the industrial revolutions, and in the Asia-Pacific region, 2 billion people, or nearly half the population of the region, don't have access to the digital world. Over the past 2 years during this pandemic, we have seen the story of the haves and the have-nots. Technology companies and online platforms have seen rising stock prices despite the global economic crisis, while an estimated 463 million students are still out of school due to school closures and limited access to quality online education. I think all of us are witnessing the sort of problems that people in some of the remote areas or the poor people who don't have access to the digital world and the impact it's really had on access to education. In this context, governments in Asia Pacific need to look more seriously at harnessing technology and innovation for the SDGs and to leave no one behind. This requires putting inclusion at the heart of technology and innovation policies. Inclusive innovation policies are designed differently from traditional innovation policies. How? They're designed not only for economic imperatives, but with social development and environmental objectives in mind. They seek to ensure that the very poorest, women and girls, benefit from innovation. They engage in a wider range of actors in the process of developing and formulating policies. Over the past 4 years, ESCAP has worked with governments to formulate more inclusive innovation policies. For instance, we've supported processes that invite a broader group of policy champions, such as representatives from the private sector and academic leaders, to co-create national science, technology, and innovation policies in Myanmar and Cambodia. As a result, the policy reflects a wider range of views and receives stronger and broader stakeholder support. Again, some other examples. In Bangladesh and Mongolia, digital pathways at Oxford and ESCAP facilitated the design of digital economy strategies that support inclusive growth. So by introducing an inclusive lens, it resulted in policies with greater focus on using digital platforms to connect those in the informal economy to financial and social protection services, delivering last-mile digital connectivity and addressing gender disparities. We've also been exploring how governments can promote grassroots innovators who develop solutions to address local problems. For instance, inspired by the work the Honeybee Network does to identify, recognize, and augment grassroots innovations, we've explored and supported efforts to promote such innovations in India, Malaysia, and the Philippines. We've also been promoting innovative business models that enable more inclusive growth, including social enterprises, impact investment, and inclusive businesses. Our work with the Inclusive Business Action Network shows that there are market opportunities for inclusive businesses to address unmet social needs of low-income and marginalized populations in ASEAN. Governments are realizing this. They're now promoting inclusive business models through adoption of national strategies and regional guidelines. Finally, ESCAP is also supporting research that helps governments make informed decisions on how to maximize opportunities of frontier technologies, such as AI, while also minimizing their risks. The pandemic has provided the opportunity for a reset and an opportunity to innovate innovation policy itself, i.e., to direct it towards inclusive and sustainable development. So I think many of the points that I've made here about how to bring in the inclusivity angle in the way we use technology and innovation is, they're very similar to what Shamika has also underlined when talking about the main insights from her report. So I'm very delighted to share with you today our report on frontiers of inclusive innovation, where we discuss some of our experiences and those of our partners in promoting more inclusive innovation policies. Before concluding, I'd also like to take this opportunity to congratulate UNCTAD for its excellent Technology and Innovation Report 2022, and also their collaboration in this webinar. It's a great pleasure to join forces with all of you to ensure we expand the frontiers of inclusive innovation, and I very much look forward to the presentations and the following discussion. Thank you very much once again for joining us.
Thank you so much, Rupa, and thank you again, Shamika, for perfectly setting the scene. Let's now move on to the next part of the webinar, which is kind of the two presentations on the reports that both Shamika and Rupa have mentioned. And may I first invite Clovis Freire, Economic Affairs Officer, Division of Technology and Logistics at UNCTAD, to give a presentation on the UNCTAD Technology Innovation Report 2021. So, Clovis, over to you.
Thank you very much, Jonathan. Let me just share my presentation. Can you just tell me if it's showing correctly? Okay.
Yep, we're good.
Thanks. So, colleagues, good morning and good afternoon. So in the next 10 minutes, I will highlight some of the new analysis of the UNCTAD's Technology Innovation Report 2021 and that has focused on frontier technologies and inequalities. The report makes the point that great divides between countries that we see today, they have started after the Industrial Revolution. So since then, every wave of progress was associated with a sharper inequality. Now the gap in the average income per capita between developed and developing countries is over $40,000. But a few countries, notably in Asia, they were able to catch up through technological learning and imitation and innovation. Many factors affect the dynamics of economic inequality, including wars, epidemics, the effect of trade and globalization. But one of the factors is the impact of technological revolutions. And the report notes that the world is at the peak of the age of ICT and that it's the starting of a new paradigm, the Industry 4.0. So the deployment of ICT has resulted in an enormous concentration of wealth in the ownership of the major digital platforms, for example. And there is also persistent digital divides, as mentioned by Shamika, by Radha, Rupa, as highlighted by the COVID-19 pandemic. So how these frontier technologies will affect inequalities between countries will depend on national policies and the involvement of countries in international trade. The report, it covers 11 frontier technologies. And estimates suggest that these technologies already represent a $350 billion market, and one that by 2025 could grow to over $3.2 trillion. Many of the major providers of these technologies are from the United States and China. They both represent and are responsible for 30 to 60% of patents and publications on those technologies. The new readiness index presented in the report, it gives us a picture of the national capabilities to equitable use, adopt, and adapt frontier technologies. And as mentioned by Shamika, in general, the economies most ready for the equitable deployment of frontier technologies are in North America and Europe, some in Asia. And most least ready countries are in sub-Saharan Africa and also some countries in Asia Pacific. But there are also clearly many outliers, countries that perform better than their per capita GDP would suggest. The two countries at the top that are overperformers are from Asia Pacific. India is the greatest overperformer. It ranks 65 positions higher than expected when we consider GDP per capita, followed by Philippines, which ranks 57 positions higher. Countries that outperforms have invested in R&D and industrial activity, access to finance. But we see that developing countries, even the outperformers, they need to do more to provide access to the internet and digital skills. Usually those are the items that bring the scores down of countries. From the production perspective, each wave of technological change brings inequality in new shapes. So today, major concerns are, for example, AI and robotics and automation and how they can reduce employment. But most alarming scenarios do not really consider that not all tasks in a job are automated. And most important, that new products, tasks, professions, and economic activities are created throughout the economy. In the report, we note that the impact of AI on inequality between countries will depend to some extent on the type of input data. If AI primarily use big data generated by users, this will mainly benefit the United States and China. Their competing digital platforms get massive amounts of user data. If AI primarily use big data generated by Internet of Things, this may benefit other countries with strong manufacturing, such as countries in the European Union, Japan, Korea, in the Republic of Korea in Asia Pacific. If computers learn by recognizing patterns and generalizing from few examples in modeling, this would still demand resource and capability that are more likely to be found in developed countries, so leaving developing countries behind. Preparing for frontier technology then will require promoting their use, adoption, and adaptation. But developing countries face many challenges, and we highlight 5 of them. The first is the change in demographics. By 2050, most of the increase in population will be in sub-Saharan Africa, and firms there may have fewer incentives to use automation as a form of saving labor costs. Another challenge is the technological gap. The risk is that low-income countries will also fall behind in the adoption of Industry 4.0, widening the technological gap. Yet another challenge is the slow diversification of many commodity-dependent countries towards manufacturing. We know that the capacity to use common technologies in manufacturing help firms to adopt new technologies. Developing countries, particularly the least developed countries, have less public and private resource to fund research and innovation. And also, stringent intellectual property rights are also likely to reinforce existing technological divides. Developing countries, they then need to adopt frontier technologies while continue to diversify their production base by mastering existing technologies. So they need to align innovation and industrial policies, keeping the national industry competitive. This will require better access to patented technologies and opportunities for technological learning, for example, through public-private R&D. Some of the finance innovations can come from impact investment, venture capital, crowdfunding, innovation, and technology funds. Policymakers also need to anticipate the impact on the workforce, so workers should be able to rely on stronger mechanisms of social protection as well. And labor unions will have a bigger role to play to protect workers' rights, especially with the gig work and on platforms and in face of automation. Now, let me turn to the other side of the analysis, and it's the potential impact of technology and inequality through the perspective of the users of the technology. So one of the most critical aspects is access, and that can be comprised by the combination of these 5 A's: availability, affordability, awareness, accessibility, and the ability for effective use of these new technologies. Again, developing countries face particular challenges. A major issue is the higher level of poverty in developing countries. In urban, middle-income countries and high-income countries, the average share of the population living in extreme poverty is only 2%, but in low-income countries, this is 45%. As a result, access to goods and services is more difficult for a larger share of population in developing countries. A second challenge is the digital divide. Almost half of the world's population remains offline, and most in developing countries. And then there is the shortage of skills in developing countries when compared with developed countries. A major concern related to the user side of the technologies related to this bias, design, or unintended consequence of AI. So bias within AI system can arise because they imply bias algorithms or biased data for training. And there is also inequalities and ethical considerations in other technologies, like, for example, gene editing. For example, in 2017, a study shows that most clinical trials in gene therapy were in the United States and Europe. So this gene editing can also raise ethical questions, such as what constitutes an ideal human being and so on. Developing countries, they should be able to rely on international cooperation to promote and guide the development and deployment of new technology. so that they support inclusive and sustainable development. And in particular, they need to build stronger national capacities in science, technology, innovation. This will mean increasing the relatively small amount of ODA directed to science, technology, innovation, particularly in least developed and low-income developing countries. Also, smooth the technology, to have a smooth technology transfer. This may involve liberalizing access to trade and technologies covered by intellectual property rights, increase women's participation in tech sectors and innovation, improve foresight and technological assessment to better understand the socioeconomic environmental implications of frontier technologies, and also promote inclusive debate on how new technologies affect people and society and how they can be used to promote the SDGs. So let me conclude to the following 3 points. First, developing countries, particularly low-income countries, cannot afford to miss this new wave of technological change. Second, each country will need science, technology, innovation policies appropriate to their stage of development to prepare people and firms for this period of rapid change. And third, this will require a balanced approach, building a robust industrial base and promoting frontier technologies that can help deliver the 2030 agenda. I stop here. Thank you very much. We look forward for the discussion.
Right. Thank you very much, Clovis. May I now invite Marta Perez-Cuso, Economic Affairs Officer, Trade, Investment and Innovation Division at ESCAP, to give a presentation on the ESCAP Frontiers of Inclusive Innovation report. Marta, over to you. Great.
Thanks very much. I just first want to check that you can see my PowerPoint presentation.
Yep. We see it well.
Okay, very good. So thank you very much, Jonathan. Good afternoon, good morning to everyone. My name is Marta Perez-Cuso, and I've been leading ESCAP's work on promoting inclusive innovation policies. And it's a great pleasure for me to share some of our experiences on supporting governments to put in place, formulate more inclusive technology and innovation policies. So our report does not focus on frontier technologies per se. It focuses on the broader efforts to promote technology and innovation. But some of the learnings of how we make those, how do we, what Clovis was saying about promoting an inclusive debate on technology promotion, on innovation, it's relevant for when considering the promotion of frontier technologies. And I would like to start this presentation with a question. Why do we promote science, technology, and innovation? Traditionally, we know that innovation policy has largely focused on economic objectives, on promoting national competitiveness, on increasing agricultural productivity, on creating jobs. However, we have a much larger daunting challenge in front of us, which is to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals by 2030. And for this, we need a new generation of technology and innovation policies that addresses not only economic goals, but also social and environmental challenges, and really also very important, that leave no one behind. So in this presentation of today, I want to focus your attention on how technology and innovation policies can deliver on the overall commitment of the Sustainable Development Goals of leaving no one behind. We know that the adoption of existing innovations have enabled many emerging economies to leapfrog and have also enabled impressive social advances. But science, technology, and innovation has also exacerbated inequalities and created new types of social divides and environmental hazards, and has established new and often harder to cross frontiers between those that benefits and the excluded. So this is a bit of a political message or call to focusing a bit more on expanding the frontiers of inclusive innovation, on ensuring that efforts to promote technology and innovation create a more inclusive society rather than a more exclusive societies. And this is what we've been trying to do at ESCAP, trying to explore what type of policies, technology and innovation policies, how they can be designed to bring in about more inclusive outcomes. And at ESCAP, we've tried to do this through a number of approaches, from supporting governments to introduce an inclusive lens in the formulation of the national STI policy and national strategies for the digital economy, and also by supporting research that can promote artificial intelligence for social good. But we have also worked at the smaller level of promoting innovations, how governments can promote innovations by the poor and not just for the poor. And finally, we have also sought to promote innovation, not just technologies, but new ways of innovating, business innovations that can sustain inclusive growth. Let me now share and highlight some of our experiences, which are contained in the report on Frontiers of Inclusive Innovation. At the strategic level, we've been working with a number of countries in supporting the formulation of the national STI policies. For example, in 2020, before the military takeover, we supported the government of Myanmar develop its national STI policy with an inclusive lens. And this was a very deliberate objective, as you can see from the title that was adopted for the strategy, Myanmar becoming an inclusive and sustainable Asian tiger. And we use an inclusive lens both in the design of the process and in the content of the policy. In terms of the process, the policy formulation used a co-creation process that combined training with co-creation sessions. And this was explicitly designed to encourage collaboration and awareness regarding STI among the relevant actors, including government agencies, the private sector, and academia, and to address the fact that there was limited knowledge and experience among government officials in formulating national technology and innovation policy. And the co-creation process was designed with inclusivity in mind. We engaged a group of 16 policy champions, what we call the Sherpas, representing different ministries, higher education institutes, and civil society and the private sector, to bring a diversity of views in the co-creation process of the co-creation of the policy. And as Dr. A.A. Tue, one of our Sherpas, said, their engagement was not only consultative, they provided direct inputs to the policy, and they facilitated the conversations with other stakeholders. In terms of the content, the analysis that was provided to inform the policy discussions included inclusive considerations. And the conversations themselves also feature specific discussions on inclusion. ESCAP has also worked with the digital pathways at Oxford to promote more inclusive digital economy strategies. And this has meant, similarly as in the case of national technology innovation policies, introducing an inclusive lens in the objective, in the analysis, in the dialogues, and in the governance of the process. As a result, these policies have introduced a more focus and more support for connecting those in the informal economy via digital platforms, more focus on exploring new approaches to deliver last mile connectivity, and an increased focus on addressing gender disparities. As I said before, we also have explored means to promote innovation by the poor, or grassroots innovation, because we think that from an inclusive perspective, the promotion of innovation for development is incomplete without augmenting the innovations of people at the grassroots, like Mr. Muru San. Learning from the experience of the Honeybee Network, we've developed a policy workbook that suggests areas that policymakers can consider to promote grassroots innovation. And we've supported learning among different countries, in particular India, Malaysia, and the Philippines. And as a result, I'm happy to share that the Philippines has now adopted a grassroots innovation development strategy. And finally, I would like to say that there's also scope for promoting innovation policies that promote more inclusive growth through promoting either social enterprises, impact investment, or inclusive business. And I'd like to share here a bit about our work on inclusive business, which is a relatively more new concept. inclusive business basically are businesses that are inclusive. That's obvious, and you have the formal definition there. What's important of this is that these are commercially viable business models. They don't depend on grants, and also they operate at large scale, and this means that their impact can also be at large scale. And of course, to be able to do good while doing well, it's important that inclusive businesses like Amru Rice continuously innovate, both in how to make their business profitable, but also on how to reduce the risk that the low-income groups they work with face. We've been supporting governments in Southeast Asia together with Inclusive Business Action Network to put in place policies that promote inclusive business. And we've already seen some results in terms of policy adoption. For example, the economic ministers of ASEAN have adopted the guidelines for promoting inclusive business in ASEAN. And a number of countries have put in place strategies and measures to promote inclusive business. So these are a bit of the four core areas where we have been exploring. These are not all, these are just an example. I mean, these are the areas where we've worked, where we had opportunity to work to introduce a more inclusive lens in the formulation and implementation of science, technology, and innovation policies. And we wanted to take some time to reflect on that experience and see what were some of the good practices, what are some of the lessons learned, what are some of the challenges ahead. And to reflect on that experience, we've used the framework of for inclusive innovation policies developed by Nesta, an independent innovation agency based in the UK. And the framework basically proposes 4 dimensions, 4 fundamental questions to examine if a policy, to what extent a policy is inclusive. And that could be an innovation policy, could be a policy on frontier technologies. The 4 dimensions to examine are, first, what's the overall objective of that policy? As it was said before, this is really a political decision. What are your overall objectives? Are only economic, or are you also seeking environmental objectives, more equality outcomes, etc.? Then the second question examine whose needs are being met. The third, who participates in innovation, who is able to take part of these innovation activities. And the fourth is who sets priority and how are the outcomes of those innovations managed. Now, from these 4 big questions, we've examined each of the 4 areas that I presented before in more detail. And to summarize here today, what are some of the reflections that we came away is that, first, that to achieve inclusive outcomes requires deliberate efforts. You have to be very purposeful in trying to seek inclusive outcomes. The second is that, of course, promoting inclusion entails addressing trade-offs. And the critical issue here is to explore what trade-offs are acceptable and how to deal with the difficult trade-offs. There are multiple needs. Inequality is increasing, and the inequality can be found in many different ambits. So given the numerous needs, we need to have a pragmatic approach. There's no way that one can address all the inequalities at once. Fourth is that designing for inclusive outcomes requires a sound basis for formulating science, technology, and innovation policy, of course, but also requires additional skills and a greater understanding of how to promote development, and also different mindsets that are looking for long-term outcomes, mindsets that are ready to innovate and to take risk to promote more inclusion. And the last few reflections is that, of course, we all know that involving a broader range of stakeholders in the policymaking process will enhance the understanding of those stakeholders and also increase the support for action. We also know that it's critical to have more disaggregated quantitative and qualitative data to be able to inform the inclusiveness of the policies, but also to monitor and evaluate. Also, from our work, we want to we identify 4 areas which are critical if we really want to advance the promotion of more inclusive innovation. The first is increased financing for inclusive innovation. The second is look more into how we are more inclusive in the implementation of those policies and strategies. Because while the policy, the overall aims, the global, the more strategic aims will seek to, we make statements of seeking inclusive outcomes. What really matters is how those are translated, for example, in the design of the specific policy instruments. Third, we need greater efforts at monitoring and evaluation the inclusiveness outputs of those policies. And the fourth, we'll need greater understanding of what are different options for sharing the benefits and risk of innovation. So with this, I'll just like to conclude the presentation, leaving a question for you. How can we further expand the frontiers of inclusive innovation? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Marta. And let's all dwell on that question as well, and we'll dwell on it on the panel as well. Again, thanks again, Marta, and thanks to Shamika, Rupert, and Clovis for really setting the scene and highlighting these key points around frontier technology, the issues of inclusion, inequality, and of course the upsides and the downsides as well. And now let's move to the panel discussion, where we'll be discussing some of these issues and opportunities through the lens of AI, or artificial intelligence. Let me start by briefly introducing the panel. In no particular order, we have Kanchana Wanishkorn, Vice President of, let me take a breath now, Office of National Higher Education, Science, Research and Innovation Policy Council. I think we'll use NEXPO as the acronym. They're from Thailand. We have Parminder Jeet Singh, Executive Director of IT for Change. We have Marcus Bartley-Jones, Asia Regional Director, Government Affairs and Public Policy at Microsoft, based in Singapore, I think. We have Mark Finlay, Professorial Research Fellow and Director, Center for AI and Data Governance, Singapore Management University. So you'll see we've got quite a good mix here of kind of government, private sector, academia, and civil society, which I think is important in bringing out kind of the breadth of different opinions and thoughts on this topic. Firstly, thank you all for joining us today. Before we get started, and Kanchana, I'll come to you first. And just a reminder, if you have any questions, don't be shy. Feel free to post them in the chat, and the panelists will either kind of answer them in the chat, or indeed we can pick them up after the panel discussion. So feel free to post your questions in the chat. So Kanchana, maybe over to you first for a government perspective. And I'm just kind of to open up, kind of, how is the government of Thailand promoting the development of capabilities in AI? So very broad question, but over to you first.
Thank you, Jonathan, and good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to all participants. First of all, thank you very much for giving me an opportunity to share Thailand experience in promoting development of AI in the country. To answer your question, I think first we have to admit that the private sector sort of have taken lead in this AI development application in Thailand, and I believe similar in other countries too. So the government was kind of called to action, you know, when they say that there's like here's and there's, because AI is cross-cutting, you know, through a number of ministries. So we sort of jump in a later stage, and I like what Shamika has mentioned, that they're coming up with government readiness index on, you know, adopting this sort of frontier technology, and AI is part of it. And one thing that we was called upon is we should have a national vision, you know, on how they would use AI for development, you know, both in terms of social and economics. And we have a long discussion, and I think for the role of the government, it's quite clear that for a country like Thailand, we want to aim for something that using AI for better quality of life of the Thai people, and also promoting innovation, and want to highlight on for inclusive growth as well, as you know, the theme of today. And for business development, we support, we see ourselves as an enabler, and we let the private sector to take the lead on this. So the first thing that we have done was we coming up with a national master plan on AI. It's a big effort that trying to coordinate a number of government agencies. We finally have these 5 pillar plans. It's about to table to the cabinet very soon. And the plans cover key things like on preparing Thailand, the Thai people in general, to have good awareness and understanding on the application of AI. In particular, AI was somehow in Thailand related to Industry 4.0 and automation, and there's some fears of the public that they would take away their jobs, and all that, and some of the privacy concerns. So we have these key pillars that touch on preparing people to understand the use of AI, but also on the implication on social and legal and ethical implication, in particular on the data privacy. The second pillar is on building AI education and AI workforce. I touch on that later. The third one is on government taking the lead in some of the key applications, in particular for promoting inclusive use of AI and also address national challenges like agriculture or healthcare. And the fourth one is on research. Definitely that's, we really need that on research and innovation. And the last one is on infrastructure, because we need some infrastructure to support this. So with that 5 points or 5 pillar strategy, we propose 7 national flagship initiatives to the government. It's first is sort of to showcase the application and also to provide a platform for people and companies and the community to work together on AI grand challenges. And we start with medicines, healthcare, food and agriculture, in particular on digital farming, smart farming. And the last one is on AI for government services. To improve government service to the public. Things like, how, we use AI to match some of the application for COVID package that would support people in different occupation, things like that. So that's the AI Grand Challenge Initiative. We also have program on AI workforce and AI for all, trying to raise awareness of AI application. We have a website called aiforall.or.th and a number of clips that we put on social medias, talks, and we also run a number of hackathon for students, to apply for this sort of contest, and they get award and they get training, and even some that was get shopped by some of the startup company, and get a job, and also on entrepreneurship development on AI, and the last 2 key flagship is on developing AI platform, some of the technology platform, some things that developer could use to further develop application. And the last one is on ethics and law. That's we have kicked off this, some of them has been kicked off on 7, the flagship initiative. So for the first round, I think I'll stop here with the 5 pillar strategy and 7 flagship initiative that the government has recently launched. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much, Kanchana. And again, under your leadership, it's led to this very comprehensive response from the government of Thailand on AI's evolution. So big thanks to you as well. And it's a pleasure to be working with you on this agenda. Let me next turn to Parminder. And again, Kanchana touched on this inclusion point, and of course, it's come up several times today, given it's the theme of the webinar. But what is the nature of exclusion in the digital economy? I suppose is my question to you, and what could be the new specific countermeasures to tackle this exclusion? So over to you, Parminder, for your thoughts.
Thank you, Jonathan, and thanks to Clovis and Marta for excellent report presentations, and I congratulate both UNCTAD and ESCAP for taking up this work on equity and innovation together. So Jonathan, to answer your question, to understand exclusion in digital economy, we need to first understand what is digital economy. And there are some emerging thoughts about it, but how we look at it is what I'm going to tell. We need to understand what is the central resource of a digital economy. What makes an economy a digital economy? And I think that the central resource of a digital economy is intelligence. Not just artificial intelligence, the technology thing, but intelligence or digital intelligence, the term which UNCTAD uses in its digital economy report. IT for Change also pioneered its use. The digital intelligence is the key thing of a digital economy. I'll explain what I mean. Now, if we look at the big tech companies which dominate digital economy, and try to see what is their main product or service, and then you will find out that it is intelligence. And I'll give the example of Uber. What do you think Uber actually owns? Uber doesn't own the cars. It doesn't have, special relationship with commuters. They have never gone and met them. But what Uber actually owns is the intelligence of when a commuter needs a car, where a car is available, where the traffic conditions are bad, and so on. It acts like a brain of the transport sector. And if you really look and focus on it, you figure out what it actually owns is the intelligence of the transportation sector. Now, Uber operates in India, and they need not even be in India. They can sit in the US and just have data inflows into it, which gets converted into intelligence, and then they own intelligence and use that intelligence to therefore control or orchestrate all the actors in that sector, whether it's a commuter, whether it's a cab driver, or today also which road to take and which road not to take. So these are intelligence corporations, and same can be said about Amazon, same can be said about those companies who organize small service providers like Urban Clap in India. They organize the small service providers. So these are intelligence corporations. Now, intelligence has appended the old model of IP-led value chains, and now intelligence corporations are coming at the top, even above IP-led companies. Earlier, it was ownership of IP, which made you central. Before that, it was the ownership of the industrial production, which made you central, but now it is intelligence ownership. Now, if intelligence ownership and control is at the heart of intelligence economy, we call it intelligence economy, actually, even beyond digital economy, but let's call it digital economy. Then let's talk about what is inclusion in a digital economy or an intelligence economy. Exclusion can be seen at two levels, and we all in UNCTAD and at UNCTAD discuss it at both exclusion from benefits and exclusion from decision making. We know the political aspect of it and the practical aspect of it. So the first side, the exclusion is from the products and the service of intelligence. Since the intelligence of transportation sector has reorganized the transportation of a particular city, exclusion from whether the service is available to you, service is available to you in good terms and all, whether all parts of the city and country are covered, etc. One is the exclusion from the fruits of intelligence. That's one kind of exclusion. And the second exclusion is to be able to decide to what purpose that intelligence is put, whether it is put in a fair manner or not. You can use the intelligence to increase the fares, you can make it more fair, give better wages to drivers, etc., etc. So the control over how that intelligence is exercised. So these are the two kinds of exclusions, and I quickly come to the second part of the question. So what could be the countermeasures? And I think they are of the four kinds. Two belong to the first kind of exclusion and two to the second kind of exclusion. First is a typical thing. Increase innovation. If the size of the pie is bigger, everybody gets a bigger part of the pie, is an old argument. And therefore, we can keep on promoting innovation, support startups, support global players, etc., and increase the pie size. That's a typical market, improve market innovation approach. Number two is that ethical approach, philanthropic benevolence approach, be good to the people, take care of the interests, is a very somewhat feudal-minded benevolence or beneficiary approach. Everybody should get its share. It's ethical, it's good, that kind of approach. That also happens. The SDG should be fulfilled. Google and Microsoft would make commitments, very well-meaning. I have no doubts about it. So this kind of philanthropic, do-good kind of approach is the second kind of approach. And the last two I will come is law-based approaches. The first of the law-based approaches is the regulatory approach, and the second is the rights-based approach. The typical regulatory approaches are like platform regulations, which are becoming very commonplace in Europe. It comes and says what could be the rules between the platforms and other actors, which the intelligence of the platform orchestrates. What is the rules of operation between Amazon platform and the traders which are working on the platform? What are the rules between Uber and the cab drivers? So they start to bring in rules of you can't do this, you have to be transparent about your algorithm, you need to do this, you need to do that. So that's the regulatory approach. I mean, again, it can be expanded, but I'm going quickly. And the last one in which our organization works a lot is a rights-based approach. The fact that this data was our data individually or collectively. Collectively is like the commuters of New Delhi own the commuting data of India, of New Delhi. So actually government of India has come up with a non-personal data committee report of which I am a part, which could possibly become a legislation, which talks about this community rights over data. So since it is our data, we produced it, we own the data. And therefore we can ask that data to be shared back with governments, also startups, which are local startups. So that kind of thing. But also we therefore should have a part in the products of that data. AI is a product of data. Since it is our data, we own our data, therefore we have a right to the benefits from data. So that's a rights-based approach. We can again be operationalized in very different manners, but I'll stop here. Thank you so much.
Great. Thank you very much, Parminder, for those insights. Very, very interesting. Let's now turn to Marcus. And again, following on from Parminder's comments, kind of what are some of the ways we can expand the benefits of AI more widely, in particular to ensure developing countries, small firms, women, and others who might be excluded can share the opportunities that AI presents? So over to you, Marcus, for your thoughts on that question.
Thanks, Jonathan. And look, I do want to thank the teams from UNCTAD and UNCTAD as well for organising this event and inviting me. And I really enjoyed the presentations at the start. I think they helped frame the issues in a very helpful way. Look, just a couple of thoughts at the macro level that I wanted to offer before going into a few specifics. I think when I'm looking at this issue of inclusion and sort of listening to thoughts on the way in which AI is being used and what types of companies are using it, what parts of the economy and society are using it, I think it's quite helpful to take a step back and just think, you know, if we want the broadest possible positive impact from an emerging technology like AI, where should we be looking to boost inclusion? And I think we often look at the technology sector or the IT industry, the digital economy as being a real area of focus. And that's important, but that tends to be 4 or 5% of the total economy. And it's the other 95% of the economy in the other sectors, including the government itself, agriculture, manufacturing, the rest of the services industry. If we look to the way in which that rest of the economy can increase its adoption of AI, you can have small businesses using AI to offer services in new ways. You can have the agriculture sector using AI in new ways. I think just having that frame of reference from the start is a helpful way of thinking about how we can maximize the benefits. And it was interesting listening to Kunkanchana talk about the way Thailand is thinking. I think there's some real synergies there. It sounds like Thailand's thinking about how to maximize these benefits across the whole economy. Just a couple of thoughts specifically. I think it's such an important lens, this one of inclusion, to look through, and the kinds of ways of thinking about that you mentioned, Jonathan, are so important. Developing, developed countries, small firms or large firms, you know, the gender lens, you know, accessibility issues. There's many ways that we need to look at this. I just want to touch briefly on 3 or 4 ideas that I think are important. I think the first is we can't forget the importance of connectivity. And I think it was a helpful reminder in both of the publications. If we look at our region, when we've still got about half of the population, depending upon different estimates, who are just lacking a basic internet connection, let alone broadband connectivity, the capacity to benefit from AI-driven services that are data and bandwidth intensive is going to be limited. So there's an important role for looking at policies that can help improve connectivity. Just one area that we've been particularly focused on is looking at opening up TV white space to extend lower cost broadband to communities in rural areas. That's not the only solution, of course, but there are ways in which relatively simple policy changes can unlock some of that connectivity. So connectivity is one. I think a second one that's foundational across so many dimensions of inclusion is the skills issue. If we don't have a really explicit focus in all countries about the ways in which workers can be equipped with the skills they need to use technologies like AI, there's a real risk of some of these dimensions of exclusion becoming more and more important. that's a challenge. At the same time, there's a real opportunity. And we see a mismatch between supply and demand in so many economies. There's such high demand for workers with those skills, but there isn't the kind of supply happening to fill open jobs. So there's a really important issue to look at there. Companies, the private sector can do its part. We run broad-based skilling programs. We've had 30 million people in 2021 acquire new digital skills, but we also need to be realistic. We're not going to fill the skills gap just with programs implemented by the private sector. This has to be a partnership approach, and the role of governments, organisations like the UN is absolutely essential in scaling some of these skilling efforts to get the kind of impact that's needed. And the last area I wanted to touch on is, I think it's so important to be thinking about inclusion and taking this inclusiveness lens when we're thinking about the way AI is developed and deployed. And we're thinking about the kinds of regulatory and governance frameworks that are going to be put in place. It's so important to have diverse perspectives involved when AI software is being designed. If we don't, say an issue like gender or accessibility, if we don't have diverse gender perspectives, if we don't have people facing accessibility related challenges involved in the design of AI systems, there's a much stronger chance that systems, when they're deployed, can risk excluding people more than boosting inclusion. So at that development stage, it's very important. At the deployment stage, making sure there's mechanisms for feedback, for users who are affected, who are concerned about a negative impact, to be able to, to express that is so important. So that's a few ways in which I think it's important to look at this inclusion issue. Data is an important one, but I think we might have a chance to touch on that later.
And thank you for mentioning so many concrete examples there of when we talk about kind of exclusion. We all know what the problem is. How do you go about addressing it? You mentioned kind of the white spaces, the skills programs. I think these are the practical solutions that everyone's looking for, particularly the policymakers who we speak to, in addressing some of these inequalities and this inclusivity issue. So thank you, Marcus, for outlining that. And we'll come back to the data question. Mark, now over to you. I mean, just from your perspective, what are some of the critical risks that developments in AI pose, particularly for more vulnerable economies and emerging economies? So over to you, Mark, on that question.
Okay, well, I'll be as brief as I can. Parminder mentioned something which was essential to answer that question, and that was the concept of access to data and use of data. Some people talk about ownership. I think ownership is perhaps a misdirected term, but the work that we're doing on digital self-determination is important, because if data subjects are left out of the picture, if they're excluded or ignored, then in many respects, there's a huge area of the ecosystem that's forgotten about. And let's face it, there's no point in talking about tech unless you talk about data. The tech itself is largely irrelevant without servicing of the data, which is so important. And as data subjects are those who produce that data and move it about. The importance of them knowing about where that data is, where it goes, and what happens to it is crucial. Back to the question of governance, it's resonated in the discussion that's come so far, the presentations that were extremely interesting, the importance of inclusion and the negative aspects of exclusion. And Marcus has raised some interesting ways in which we can confront that. Could I say we really need to get down to some very specific frameworks for that inclusion? The work that we're doing on AI in community is an important approach to that. The approach being that the development of relationships of trust between community recipients of AI and the AI technology itself is essential, not just so that those promoters of the AI get new markets and wider sales, but more specifically that individuals who operate within the community and could benefit from new technologies are aware of the pluses and minuses and can participate from day one. Could I suggest, with the example of robotics, which has become very popular in certain areas of the global response to health service delivery with aging populations and pressure on health service delivery, too often the discussion of robotics is about standardization, safety, risk minimization, without really talking about what the recipient wants, what the recipient perceives, what the recipient community is actually prioritizing. And so we argue that if you want to have a framework which is active, which is realistic, which is pragmatic for the rollout of AI, particularly across the globe where connectivity is so limited in some areas and knowledge is also something which is at a premium, you need to have frameworks within the community which generate bonds of trust or which have areas of distrust which are explicable and not based on misinformation. My final point would be this, that the push behind AI as a partner to the SDGs has often been based on overemphasizing development rather than sustainability. And in some respects, the new technologies and new attitudes to data may not necessarily increase economic development at all. In fact, what they might do is give vulnerable economies and vulnerable communities the opportunity to decide what domestic markets they'll protect and what they'll give away or trade. And that may not be an economic stimulus, it might be a sustainability decision. I've worked in the Pacific. I know Pacific countries that have been basically made slaves to free trade because of the fact that their sustainability has been basically sold. Now, I think AI can provide access to information that these vulnerable economies never had. And if you want a microcosm snap of that, look at what happened with the pandemic and vulnerable areas within communities, domestic workers, foreign domestic workers, foreign construction laborers in the areas in which I currently reside, the elderly who knew very little about technology were largely alienated through the rollout of tech, which became the cornerstone of many governments' reactions to the risk of the pandemic. We can't have situations where through techno-colonialism, the techno divide simply builds up on the fact that vulnerable communities and vulnerable sections within the community are largely passed over. So I think if we're looking at the development of technology as a way of advancing the Sustainable Development Goals, start with vulnerability first. Where are those areas in communities, in specific societies, which are most vulnerable now without the tech? And will they become more vulnerable with the tech if dependency relationships are created and their vulnerabilities are ignored?
Great. All great points, Mark. And again, this vulnerability first approach, I think is kind of an excellent way of framing kind of an approach that we should be taking to this, particularly in the context of SDGs and sustainable development. So thank you. Kanchana, let me now go back to you. And I know you have data's coming up a lot. And I know you have views on this as well, but I mean, can you just tell us a bit more about some of the problems that companies, indeed research institutions in Thailand are currently facing to be able to see the benefits and reap the benefits of AI and these new techniques that are being kind of applied? So over to you.
Yeah, I have to echo Mark and Parminder on this challenge in data sharing and data governance. That's key issues that came up in all the meetings that I, even both with companies and also research agency. And as we have discussed, you need good data to have good, AI to develop good AI application. And what we are facing is first, people that has the algorithm doesn't have the data. People that has data, sometimes they're afraid to share that data. And even, okay, they would like to share the data with the developer who owns, who has the right to use, and how do you share the benefits of that application? It's a long debate. So that's one of the challenge in data sharing and data governance, in particular with the new law on the PDPA, the privacy of data. So that's something that we are working on. in developing guidelines for government agencies or even local governments that own the data, what would be the most appropriate way to share that data, ensure responsible and accountable data sharing in different contexts, in public health, in agriculture. We even think about having a sandbox. Actually, we have an innovation sandbox act, not an act, but it's part of the Science Research Innovation Promotion Act that we could initiate innovation sandbox. The challenge is even that is, how do you design the guidelines for an AI innovation and development sandbox? This is, I don't have the answer for that, and I'd like to post that for everyone. That's the key challenge for us. One project that we are working on, and actually we are planning on working with at ESCAP on this AI for social good initiative, is on poverty eradication program that the government of Thailand has announced that, believe it or not, we have about 42 government support for the poor, but it's sort of like a generic for everyone, right? And now we have a better data. We know at household level and even individual level, the poor family and low income people. How do we decide a tailor-made support, government support using AI? Give them what they need at the right time. The policy is quite clear, but how do we leverage on the data from different government agencies to decide that the support for the poor? This is one of the projects that we are working on, and we welcome suggestion from other countries as well. We believe that data are very important in designing a better government support and government services. And another thing that I would like to raise as a challenge, in addition to data sharing and data governance, is on skills and capacity development. This is something that we have to have a good balance on the supply side and the demand side, because governments always blame that we always do supply push, and we do training, and then people doesn't have a good job. So what we are experimenting is we do on both sides. On the developing AI engineers, we have a program to recruit students or even startups, about 1,000, and we would put them through the training and intensive and acceleration program. And we hope that we would have a very good and qualified AI engineers, about 100 of them. But we also need to provide them some jobs as well, and a real case. So we also are working on a program that we invite SME that have interest in using AI to improve their product and service, aiming for 5,000 if we get the budget SMEs to apply for that. So with that, we hope that we can provide a platform to both develop skills and workforce, and also promoting adoption of AI in business and also government services. So I hope I touch on, I give you the answer. Okay. Yep. Thank you.
Thank you so much again, Kanchana. I'm going to use my moderator privileges here and apologize to the rest of the panel. I'm not going to ask you some of the questions that you thought I was going to ask you now. So I do want to, data's come up so many times that I do want to actually come back to this. And Marcus, maybe I come to you first actually on this issue of how can we ensure data is actually shared more openly, given that it's actually a foundational role and has a foundational role in AI's evolution. And then Parminder and Mark, I've got a specific question for you following this as well, but maybe Marcus, over to you first.
Yeah, look, thanks, Jonathan. And I do think it's such an important issue. And if we're focused on promoting inclusion in the use of AI, we really need to have a clear focus on where is data, who has it, and how can we share it more. One thing that we're very focused on, and I think it's widely recognized, is there's a very real risk of a growing data divide globally. It's a divide between countries, it's a divide between companies, frankly. And I say that working at a very large technology company, we're very aware of the growing risks if there isn't more data being shared more widely across the economy. And with data being the critical input for AI, and AI being critical for competitiveness, you can sort of see some of the the negative reinforcement that could happen if we don't manage to open up data more. We've been doing some work across Asia on this over the last year or so, and it's quite striking. There's such strong interest that we hear from governments in doing more to promote data sharing and data collaboration and opening up data more. And, you know, I think when Kanchana was touching on some of that for Thailand, yet there's a gap with making it happen and making it happen in a way that has real impact. So what we've been trying to do is just gather the stories of organizations that have tried to get involved in data sharing initiatives and collaborate, you know, to open up their data, to collaborate with another partner and try to have some positive impact based on that. And there's 3 learnings that have come from that I'll just touch on briefly, because I just think it's so relevant to this wider issue of data and AI and inclusion. But the first lesson that came through very clearly from talking with all of these you know, data collaboration participants is the critical role government can have. Obviously, government can have a key role in opening up its own data and sharing that, and that can be a catalyst for all sorts of activity across the economy. But the way that the government sets the overall policy framework is so important as well. You know, we look at a privacy regulator like Singapore that's taken an explicit approach of putting out guidance so that organizations in Singapore can understand how to share data and how to open it up while doing so in a privacy protecting way. And you know, organizations find that kind of guidance very helpful. So there's those practical things that governments can do. The second learning that we've taken very clearly is the importance of protecting trust. One of the key barriers that stands in the way for a lot of organizations of opening up data more is their concern that they might inadvertently breach the privacy of user data. They're concerned that it might lead to some kind of security incident. And those are valid concerns, but you know, we think there just needs to be more sharing of practical ways in which those privacy concerns and security concerns can be addressed. And there's technology pieces to that, there's governance pieces to that, how do organizations have governance over their own data. And look, the final learning, just very briefly, is I think it's self-evident. It's the importance of public-private collaboration in this space. The private sector has huge amounts of data, governments have huge amounts of data, the research community does. If there's one positive lesson we can take from COVID, and this was touched on before, it's the kind of positive impact we can have when there's more of that public-private collaboration to solve problems that societies face. So, you know, those 3 areas, the supportive actions by government, overcoming some of the trust challenges, and then public-private cooperation are some of the practical ways that we think more data can be shared, there can be more of that collaboration to overcome the risk of a growing data divide.
Great, thank you so much for those insights, Marcus. Again, sticking on the topic, and again, apologies, Parminder and Mark, I'm veering off script here. But Parminder, you mentioned this issue around data ownership, and Mark as well, around issues of access to data and use of data. I mean, I think it's well understood that kind of the positive benefits of kind of moving people as shifting the paradigm from data sources to kind of data owners is kind of well understood. But actually, are you seeing any practical examples of actually how we can make this possible? It's just again a reflection on just what the both of you said on the issue of data. But maybe Parminder, over to you first for any thoughts on that. Any kind of practical case studies you've seen of how this has happened in an effective manner, particularly with inclusion in mind?
Okay, the first thing about Mark talked about techno-colonialism, etc., and dependencies, and the use of word ownership. So first of all, let us recognize that if in an earlier era, the word property could be used for knowledge, which looks like a very non-owning thing, there's no given linguistic reason that ownership should not be used for data. I'm just placing it on one side. Knowledge was also like a very good, free and everything, but we have the word property, intellectual property over knowledge. So let's put it aside. Second thing, and I take it from the earlier thing which I'm talking, is now you would, in a policy discussion in public interest, you would expect me to be frank and honest. And I am all for voluntary data sharing, but all of us recognize today that everybody says that data is the single most valuable resource. It is at the heart of digital economic configuration, as IP was the earlier resource. So voluntary sharing is good, but there can be no more voluntary sharing of data Then there was voluntary sharing of intellectual property for really useful data, which is at the heart of the intelligence I was talking about. And if anybody has doubts about voluntary sharing of intellectual property, look at what compulsory licensing is at in middle of COVID era. And I closely follow what's happening at WTO. For last 1.5 years, developing countries have been trying to convince just people that just for COVID-related equipment, medicines, and diagnostics, can you loosen up intellectual property, which in other language means voluntarily share your intellectual property. And for such a crisis, disaster, people are not ready to share voluntarily IP. And there is no better reason that they would share what is the most valuable resource of a digital economy. We can realize it after 5 years or 10 years and come back, so we thought they would do it. I'm very sorry they didn't do it. Or we can be foresightful and now look at facts and realities of the world. And you talked about, this is not a theory. There are laws being made, not only in India, I'll come to the India last, in Europe, which I think looks like a more acceptable in a colonial sense point of reference. There is a Digital Markets Act, which seeks mandatory sharing of data on with platform-dependent actors, the data which is on the platforms. Not only individual data, but collective data. Actually, Uber drivers can collectively ask their data to be mandatorily shared from Uber. Digital Markets Act out there. There's a new act coming in EU, which is saying Data Act, which says that those who participated in generation of data have economic rights of data. So these, and I mean, let's be frank, fair, honest here. The central resources of digital economy is not going to be voluntarily shared. I'm sorry, I'm repeating it, but it's a very important thing to get across. No more than IP was voluntarily shared. To the extent they do it, I'm very happy. I'll clap and celebrate every corporation doing it. In India, we now have, and I am a part of that non-personal data framework, which has come out with a report and possibly a legislative framework where collective rights are used to enforce sharing of certain raw, non-intellectual property protected raw data of certain kinds, which are considered as high value data, infrastructural data with startups from that. So this is the kind of data sharing, and the facts of technical capabilities of data sharing are also being developed. And this is a very complex thing. Both the technical infrastructure, the governance systems over the technical infrastructure of sharing are complex things. I think we should devote us to those real practical things. And that work has actually started both in Europe through one GAIA project, GAIA project in Europe. And India has also started working on it. And I know South Africa is working on some legislative sides of it also. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much, Parminder. Mark, over to you.
Okay, very quickly, I think the concept of voluntariness is deeply problematic when we're talking about data. Very simply, if you look at the massive social media platforms that make personal data, which might seem insignificant and extremely valuable through data reusing, they do that on the basis of artificial consent, that the data subject consents to the use of the data only on the basis that if they don't, they can't use the benefits of the platform. The real issue, I think, here with data sharing is that the majority of data that's shared, personal data that's shared, the data subject doesn't know about it. So it's the process of data reuse that has become so massively market oriented and is incredibly dangerous from a social point of view for vulnerable economies, because data is money, and in many respects the debate isn't so much a debate about who owns it or who doesn't own it, it's about who uses it. And in many respects with data reuse, so much of data reuse goes in a clandestine environment that the data subject knows nothing about it whatsoever. I mean, you must have been annoyed, or everyone's been annoyed by the advertising prompts that you get after your data has been used in another form without necessarily knowing about it. Now, what we do with data governance, we talk very much in terms of digital self-determination, which is the idea of not so much discussions about rights or sovereignty or ownership or, things that certainly do relate to pre-internet property, but we talk about respectful access to data. And if you have the data sharing, the data sharing has to be on the basis of the informed data subject, whether they are from rich countries, poor countries, wherever they might be. If the data subject doesn't know about the use of the data, then in that situation, they've got no chance of being involved in its management. Just finally, I'll make a point about data sharing. There's absolutely no doubt that during the pandemic and following the pandemic, we have seen examples of mass data sharing, public and private. The division is broken down in places like China. Alibaba and the state threw together massive amounts of personal commercial data as part of the process of control without data subjects' approval. Now, my concern is with the development of smart cities, the development of technologized environments, the pushing of tech transformation right across all economies, vulnerable or strong, you find a situation where individuals within communities and neighborhoods are largely being dispossessed of their data through secondary use. Now, this just isn't a question about who gets the money for the use. That's a market issue. Much more important is, do we want that data used or not? Can we have respectful arrangements which exist between the data subject and those who choose to use that data for their own commercial purposes? And without that information, you won't get trust. Without that information sharing, you won't get situations where those who claim ownership rights will be much more interested to move back from that contest and get involved in useful, respectful, and fair data sharing. So my concern, I think, ultimately is that the information deficits that exist around data producers, and they are, you and me, is the start of the problem. Without digital self-determination, where you can have an opportunity for data subjects to know and then to act on that basis, then the concept of regulating personal privacy or regulating personal data becomes a luxury for the majority of people in those countries where those rights are not actionable.
Thank you, Mark. We're sadly out of time. It's my terrible moderation. We could go on, and I've got so many other questions. But in the interest of not taking too much of your time, I think we need to wrap up now. But just a huge thank you to you all for sharing your insights on this. And I think certainly, particularly, all of you highlighted some solutions around how we can make technology innovation and AI in particular. How we can direct to more inclusive and equitable outcomes. So I thank you for that. I think it's clear there's still many issues and challenges as expected around all of this. But I think the whole purpose of getting you as a group here to discuss this was because I think in the UN, we do think we need a diversity of opinion, and we have representatives from government, private sector, academia, and civil society here. So thank you all so much for bringing your perspectives to the conversation. I think still much more work to do. But we look forward to continuing the conversation in the future. So thank you all again. Thank you to Shamika and Rupa, Clovis and Martha for the presentations. Thank you again to our panelists. And thank you all to our audience. I hope you enjoyed the session. If you want to stay involved and up to date with our work, please do check into ESCAP and UNCTAD's website. You can also follow RNet and STI as part of ESCAP's website as well, and newsletter. So thank you all again, many thanks, and I wish you all a good day, a good afternoon, and a good evening. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.